I used to like to go exploring in the woods, not anymore. My name is Jake Summersville. My mom and dad both have advanced degrees in agricultural sciences, whatever that means. They would survey land, crops, sometimes even the local wildlife. I wasn't sure what exactly it was they did, but I knew it was why we moved around a lot. I didn't mind though, after all I liked exploring, sometimes pretending I was Indiana Jones searching for some lost ancient civilization. Sure, I've had my fair share of close calls, but nothing serious ever happened to me. At least, not until we moved to a small town in Missouri. I don't remember the name of it due to the mental trauma I experienced, or so my psychiatrist says, but I do remember Zach Mays. Zach was 9 years old that summer, the same age as me. He was into a lot of the same things I was, especially exploring. I met him when my parents moved into this farmhouse. It wasn't big or fancy or neat like the usual houses we rented, but it had a sort of rustic charm to it. Zach's parents owned the land the house was on and the property next door where they lived. They were friendly enough, even offering to help my parents get settled in. As they were handing the house keys to my parents, Zach came around the corner, held out his hand, and announced who he was. I was never the one to make friends, what with the constant moving around and whatnot, but something about Zach just clicked. We had moved at the start of summer break, so Zach and I had plenty of time to play. We'd mostly go exploring, capturing small animals and releasing them back into the wild. We had all of 4 acres to ourselves, except for the area near the edge of the property line. That was the start of the woods. Naturally, both of our parents forbade us from going in there, but we did anyways. We'd clear our own trails, pretending we were in a lush jungle. One time, Zach swore he saw a copperhead, but we never did find it. At first, we'd stay relatively close to the edge, but as time went on, we became more relaxed. Before long, we were trekking deep into the woods, able to find our way back with markers we'd given names to. One day, at the edge of the property line, we came across a patch of woods that were different somehow, darker. Thorn bushes were common in the woods, but this place was completely covered in them. In fact, it was so thick, we couldn't hope to gain entry. We walked around it for what seemed like hours, but never did find a way past those thorns. As time passed, we forgot about that place in the woods. After all, there was so much left to explore. To my delight, my parents told me that we were going to be here for a while, something to do with anomalies in the surrounding forest. Zach and I ended up in the same classes, and before we knew it, we were fast approaching Halloween. The forest, which was once green and beautiful, so full of life, had transitioned into a graveyard of fallen leaves and claws reaching despairingly into the sky. It was like they were begging the sky to return the leaves to them. On October 30th, Zach was staying over at my place for the night. It was just the 2 of us in the middle of nowhere. Our parents had gone to some boring adult dance party where kids weren't allowed. We were sitting on the floor in front of the TV, watching horror movies, when out of nowhere Zach elbowed me in the side. Scowling, I asked him what the big deal was, and his face lit up. "Do you remember that thorny part of the forest?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Why?" "Let's go in there. Everything's dried up. We can cut through those thorns easily now." I was hesitant first. Something about that idea seemed off, seemed wrong. But I didn't want Zach to think I was a chicken, so reluctantly, I agreed. We grabbed our backpacks, stuffing them with supplies for our adventure. Zach placed a pair of garden shears and a spare flashlight in his, while I grabbed a map of the area, some batteries, and an extra flashlight for mine. We then grabbed our jackets and a pair of flashlights, then headed out the door towards the woods. The moon was blood red and full that night, bathing everything in that eerie hue. It was almost as if the very earth itself were stained with blood. It had been a while since either of us had been in the woods, what with school and all, but we found our landmarks with ease. I didn't know it at the time, but those landmarks would save my life. Before long, we were at the edge of the property line, staring at that part of the forest which we've never been able to enter before. "Look, they're gone," exclaimed Zach. Sure enough, the thorn bushes had vanished. It was almost as if the forest itself wanted us to enter. There was something foreboding about this part of the forest. While the surrounding trees stretched their branches outwards in all directions, the trees in front of us grew closely together, their branches reaching inwards into the darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine, and suddenly, I didn't want to go in there anymore. Zach must have felt it too, because he shivered for a moment. We flipped on our lights and peered into the darkness. Upon closer inspection, the thorns were still present. They just were cleared to form a path into the woods. Zach knelt down, a puzzled look on his face. I don't see any tracks, human or animal, going into the forest, Zach said. We concluded that someone or something must have cleared that path some time ago. Whatever had, it didn't look like it was still around or had been back in quite a long time. I didn't like it. The way the trees were so unnaturally bent made me feel as if the forest were waiting to swallow us whole. As ghastly as that sounded, that wasn't the most disturbing part. What was disturbing was I felt compelled to go into those woods. Zach and I looked at one another before moving on. We walked in between the thick trees, our flashlights providing the only source of light in the otherwise pitch-black woods. The night was silent, spare for the sound the leaves made as we walked on top of them. I couldn't help thinking they sounded like bones crunching beneath our feet. Occasionally, the trees would part, allowing the moon's red hue to trickle down them like blood. I was relieved when we at last emerged from the forest into a clearing. The trees opened up to a flat field that had to be at least an acre, maybe more. The ground was barren, spare for a few trees here and there. In the middle was what appeared to be a lake. I had grabbed a map earlier and pulled it out of my bag. I had our property drawn on it with the woods circled. There were no bodies of water anywhere near our property on the map. I handed the map to Zach, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. We couldn't have walked for more than 5 minutes, I said. Zach looked as confused as I was. We tried to locate ourselves on the map, but aside from the lake, there were no other defining features. At that moment, my gut was telling me to go back, to get the hell out of there, but then Zach started walking towards the lake, so I followed. He reached it before I did and let out a gasp. Dude, come look at this, he said, in almost a whisper. It's not right. Those words would haunt me for the rest of my life. It almost felt as though my legs had a mind of their own, moving on their own accord. Before long, I was standing next to Zach at the edge of the water. It didn't take me long to see what he meant. Our reflections weren't in the water, but everything else was, only different. A few trees grew along the shoreline, but what was reflected back was, well, I don't know what to call it. The trees, instead of being barren, were covered in what looked like flesh. It was then that I noticed we weren't the only things not reflected on the water's surface. The sky, blood moon and all, was also absent. In its place was a seemingly endless black void. That's so weird, Zach mumbled. Zach's voice freed me from my trance. He walked along the bank until he found what he was looking for. A stick. I don't think we should be here, I said to Zach, but he just ignored me. It was as if something was making him pick up that stick. As Zach approached the surface, I saw the water move as if there was something just beneath the surface. I tried to call out his name, but no sound came out of my mouth. I just stood there, frozen to the spot, as he knelt down, prodding the surface of the water with the stick. He did this a few times, then stood up and looked at me. It's just water, he said, taking a step forward. It was then he lost his balance and fell backwards into the water, a look of surprise on his face. I expected him to break the surface once the splash had subsided, but he never did. At first I thought he was fooling around, but seconds turned to minutes, and I realized he wasn't pranking me. I ran towards the spot where he had fallen into the lake, slowing as I approached the edge, not wanting to touch the surface. I shone my light into the murky depths, scanning for any sign of my friend. As I was about to give up, I saw it. Zach's flashlight was on. except it was near the entrance into the forest that was reflected in the water. I looked back at where we had entered, seeing no flashlight, but when I returned my gaze to the lake, there it was. It never crossed my mind to run back and call the police, and even if it had, what would I tell them? That my friend fell into a lake and was transported to some alternate, nightmarish reality? Yeah, right, like they would believe me. I wouldn't have believed me if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. I began to shiver uncontrollably. It wasn't that it was particularly cold that night, it was the thought of what I had to do. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and placed it on the ground a few feet from the bank before taking my bag off. I unzipped it and stuck my hand inside the opening and pulled out the spare flashlight. I turned it on and laid it next to my phone, its beam pouring into the water. I didn't have a signal here, but I could get one near the barn, and I wanted it ready because, well, I had a very unsettling feeling. I slowly approached the water's edge, not knowing what to expect. I inhaled deeply and jumped in, feet first. What I felt next is hard to describe. It was cold, very cold, as if I had jumped into ice water, and I felt as though my insides were being torn inside out. It was like vertigo, but not quite the same. It was as if I had lost all my senses, including direction. When I emerged from the lake, I took a huge breath of stale, dry air. I climbed out of the water and looked around. I was there, in the nightmare forest. Up ahead, I could see Zach's flashlight abandoned on the ground next to his backpack. I was about to call out his name when I saw them. The garden shears he brought lay broken in two on the ground, and each blade was coated in thick blood. I picked them up, not wanting to be out here defenseless. The forest was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The trees were covered in tendrils of flesh, wet and pulsing, as if alive. The world was dimly lit, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I looked up at the sky, but saw only darkness. No moon, no stars, just pitch-black darkness. I felt as though if I were to jump, I would be consumed by that darkness, and again the feeling of being swallowed whole rushed over me. As I walked, the forest floor made a mix of a squishing sound followed by a dull thud, as though there was metal beneath the flesh. I followed the path into the woods, headed back towards my house. Here and there were pieces of Zach's clothing stuck to the trees. It looked as if he was running from something. I made it out of the thicker forest, back into familiar territory, if you could call it that. All of our landmarks were there, albeit somewhat hard to make out due to the flesh. I was almost to the edge when I heard a blood-curdling scream. It was Zach. I ran faster than I thought I ever could, the foul air burning my lungs as I took short breaths. I slowed as I reached the clearing, unable to breathe. Parts of Zach's pants lay in tatters on the ground, with a large amount of blood leading towards the barn. The barn was a stark contrast to the forest. It was comprised not of wood, but of rusted metal. And though the tendrils climbed up the perimeter, they didn't extend more than maybe 3 feet. I approached the doors cautiously, holding a blade in each hand, and pushed them open. What I saw next, I'd never forget. Zach's body was hung on a meat hook, its jagged edge protruding through his right upper chest. His shirt was soaked in blood, which traveled down his legs. His pants were shredded, and where his feet used to be were mangled lumps of meat, with bits of bones sticking out at odd angles. It looked like something had chewed them off, and I shuddered at the thought of what did this to him. Beneath him was a steadily growing puddle of blood. I would have thought him dead had he not looked up at me. Slowly, he reached his left hand into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it out to me. As his arm stretched, he mouthed the words, "Get out," though all that came out his mouth was a gurgling sound followed by blood. I put the blades down and took it, then watched as my friend took his last breath. I looked at his phone and saw he had taken a picture of what had attacked him. It was human-like, but distorted. Its legs and arms were long and lanky, skin stretched thinly over bone. It had a small tail, like what you would see on a tadpole. Its feet and hands both ended in 4 digits, each complete with long, sharp claws. Its spine protruded from its back and looked as if it would tear right though at any moment. It had a neck twice as long as a normal human, with a round head at the end. It was facing downwards in the picture, so I couldn't see what its face looked like. I looked up and noticed that Zach wasn't the only one hanging in the barn. There were several bodies, each in varying stages of decomposition, hanging from hooks. Some were bones picked clean of flesh, while others looked as though they had been hanging there for months. At that point, I doubled over and threw up, and when I raised my head, I saw it. The creature. Its face was something straight out of a nightmare. Where its face should have been was a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth, sunken into the head. It kind of reminded me of the giant maw of the Kraken as it devoured one of Odysseus' ships. On either side were two small, beady black eyes as dark as the night sky. As it lunged at me, I fell backwards, my thumb hitting the camera button. A bright light flashed from the phone, and the creature stumbled backwards, emitting a horrible screeching noise that sounded like a dozen birds going through a meat grinder. I got to my feet and I ran, bolting from the barn into the woods, the creature still screeching madly. I heard multiple screeches echo from within the woods as I ran. Just how many of those things were out there, I didn't want to know. My body moved on autopilot, following the markers that Zach and I had followed so many times before. At one point, I saw one running at me on all fours from my right side. Instinctively, I took its picture, glad to see it stumble and fall. I ran into the thicket of trees that lead to the lake, sprinting as quickly as I could without falling over. As I made it into the clearing, I fell and felt a searing pain shoot down from my left leg into my foot. One of the creatures had dug its claws into me and was dragging me back into the woods. Zach's phone had fallen a few feet from me, and I couldn't reach it. To my right was his bag with a spare flashlight sticking out from the top. I grabbed it. I never prayed so hard in my life like I did that night in the woods. Please God, let it work. Please God, let it work. I muttered as I pointed it towards the creature and flipped the switch on. Immediately, a beam of light shone from the flashlight directly into the creature's face. It released me, retreating back into the darkness, howling in pain. I half ran, half limped to the water's edge, all the while the screeches of the creatures grew in volume behind me. Reflected in it was my world. Trees without flesh, a sky alight with stars, and a forest devoid of those things. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into the water, not caring about the return of that vertigo feeling. I emerged from the surface and took in a deep breath of air that didn't taste like death. I pulled myself onto the shore and collapsed, panting. I laid there, listening for those creatures to break the surface, but they never did. I turned off the flashlight by my phone, put them in my bag, and began limping into the forest. As I made my way through the dark thicket, I heard the screeching of one of those creatures. I turned around, fumbling with the flashlight, and dropped it, causing the bulb to shatter. I turned and ran, not noticing the pain in my leg, and not stopping until I had reached the barn. With the adrenaline fading, I collapsed beneath the light above the doors. For a second, I could have sworn that I saw one of those things lurking in the woods. I wasted no time. I pulled my phone from out of my pocket and called the police, telling them my friend had been killed. I don't know how long I sat there. It felt like an eternity. I was beyond happy to hear the sirens as they approached. I don't remember much else of that night. I know my parents were there, pale as ghosts when they saw my leg as I sat in the ambulance. I saw Zach's parents there as well. His mother was on her knees, face buried in her hands, crying. His father just stood there, one arm on his crying wife, his face devoid of any emotion. At that point, it all became a blur. I awoke the next morning in the hospital, my parents asleep in the bed next to mine. Apparently, I had lost a lot of blood from my wound and had passed out. I remember feeling uneasy at the thought of having someone else's blood inside of me. The police questioned me, and I told them everything. I told them about the forest, about the lake, the nightmarish worlds, and the creatures. I even told them how to find it. They didn't believe me, of course, and I had left Zach's phone back by the lake. They surmised that Zach and I were attacked by an animal. And after seeing it maul my friend to death, my mind, influenced by the Halloween movies, created that world to cope with the trauma. Nonetheless, the police formed a search party and went into the woods, searching for what remained of Zach's body. They never did find it, nor did they find that patch of woods that led to the lake. It was as if that part of the forest simply disappeared. I had to take physical therapy, as well as talk to a shrink regularly. My leg recovered, but I never stopped having nightmares from that night, even though it's been years since it happened. My parents didn't stay in that town long after that, and I was glad. I hated the looks the other kids at school would give me, or how they would keep asking what really happened out there in the woods. Now, whenever my parents have work, they make sure to rent a house in town, far from any nearby woods. Sometimes, though, late at night, I can hear that creature in the distant woods, screeching in a mix of anger and hunger. Hunger. For me. Story 1 credit. Shawn Badolian. 10 people. 10 people in 10 different places doing 10 different things, but all sharing one single thought. What if it really works? You see, in our little town of Saundhurst, California, there was an age-old tradition tied to a myth so old that its origins were not remembered, nor could they be traced back to their beginnings. It was just something that had become a Halloween tradition for some, a creepy story to share around Halloween campfires for others, and for a very unlucky chosen few, a Halloween nightmare, or so the stories go for. What is known is that at 11 p.m. every Halloween, 10 of the townsfolk show up at the entrance to the town's only cemetery. It's not known for certain what the purpose for this gathering is, but rumor has it that they are all being allowed 1 hour to visit with someone they know who has died, and with whom, for reasons of their own, they have a desire to see once more. And from 11 p.m. until midnight, their dearly, or perhaps undearly departed appear to them, and communication is possible between the dead and those who have been left behind. Now mind you, these are simply the tall tales that seem to be almost a requirement in almost every small town in America, as it has been since the beginning of time. Nothing is known for certain about this annual ritual by the general townsfolk because the none or should who return sure ain't saying a word. Not a one single danged gosh darned word. Now you heard it right. I did say 10 people showed up at the cemetery entrance, and yes, I did say 9 would leave. As to the soul that is never seen again, well, that's all there is. They are simply never seen again. As for those who do return, I've heard tales that back in the beginning, some relatives or friends of the one who was lost might try to stir up a fuss, wondering what happened to that soon, or daughter or husband, wife, or what have you. But if they stirred up too much trouble one morning, folks in the town wake up and find they just disappeared. Of course, not all of them disappear. Some just wake up one day, struck plumb dumb. Yep, wake up acting like all the sense in their heads took a late-night train to Hollywood and left behind a slobber monster with the IQ of a cooked carrot. But now, those whose loved ones don't come back to them by the final stroke of midnight keep their questions to themselves and not be trying to raise any ruckus. Folks seem to feel it's safer that way. Now what's that, you asking? Well, of course you can see into the cemetery, and you're darned tootin' if the whole population hasn't tried to get a gander at the happening that go on for that magical hour. But all they see is the 10 people form a circle, holding hands and being what sounds like one of those sing-song poems. You know, like the little unsure always coming around with. And then a thick fog appears out of nowhere and just disappears all those folks. Then when the big clock down in the town proper behind, to count off the 12 strokes of midnight, 10 people simply walk out of that there cemetery. Just the same as they walked themselves in there. But don't go wasting your time trying to get them 9 who return to talk, 'cause it ain't gonna happen. Not one of those who return had ever said a single word about what goes on once that fur rolls in. Not a single person. Not a single word. Not once. Ever. And so the mystery forever remained for most of the people of this mostly forgotten town. Except for those 10 who would meet at the cemetery gates each Halloween. Jimmy is one of the 10, and tonight is Halloween. And yes, Jimmy shared the same thought as the others chosen to meet at the cemetery gates. Thoughts of, what if it's real, and what if it works? Jimmy had been chosen by Ronnie, whom he knew, and while they weren't exactly friends, they did attend the same high school. Ronnie was a senior, while Jimmy only a freshman. When Ronnie first approached Jimmy and told him he had been chosen as one of the 10, and that he would be granted 1 hour with his sister, Carol, who had been found dead 3 years earlier at the age of 9, Jimmy at first laughed it off, thinking himself chosen to be the victim of one of the constant pranks freshmen were always being subjected to at the hands and minds of seniors, and basically laughed it off. But Ronnie was persistent, and finally convinced Jimmy he was for real. Ronnie told Jimmy to meet him and the others at the cemetery gates at 10:45 p.m., and don't be late. He further explained that he would have only 1 hour with his loved one, and when the town clock started counting down the 12 strokes of midnight, here better be it of the cemetery, or he would start spending eternity with his loved once sooner than planned. As the day off Halloween slowly edged towards night, and the time to meet the others at the cemetery grew nearer, Jimmy found himself growing more and more nervous. At last, the appointed time arrived, and Jimmy began making his way to the cemetery gates, where he discovered the others had already arrived. Ronnie, dressed in black, as were all the others as they had been instructed, welcomed the ones he had chosen, and walked with them. They the cemetery gates, and into the cemetery, where he asked them to form a circle and to join hands. He once more explained that they must take care to be at the cemetery by the final stroke of midnight, or they would remain forever. He then informed them that one of them would not make it. The others didn't think anything other than Ronnie was trying to scare them, so said nothing. Although a couple did make what they hoped were scary monster sounds, which Ronnie ignored. Ronnie explained that they would each in their own turn repeat the change of, "By the light of the noon on All Hallows Eve, give me 1 hour free from my grief. Bring forth." And here they were to enter the name of the person they wanted to see from the other side. Ronnie then said he would now choose the first and called on a girl named Cindy, a cute little blonde, who, like Jimmy, was also a freshman in high school. Cindy stepped forward and repeated the chant of, "By the light of the moon on All Hallows Eve, give me 1 hour free from my grief. Bring forth my father Tom." To everyone's amazement, a dog rolled in, but through the food, they could see a shadow begin to appear, and Cindy squealed with delight and yelled, "Daddy," as she cheerfully ran towards her father. Jimmy was the next to be called, and after repeating the chant, his sister appeared, and for an hour they laughed, cried, played, and Joes, and finally Jimmy said, "I guess I just wanted to say I love you one more time." And as his sister opened her mouth to respond, the town clock began counting of the 12 strokes of midnight. So whatever she planned on saying was forgotten, and she instead yelled, "Go Jimmy, run," as she slowly faded away. Jimmy ran as fast as he could, and were the cemetery gates before the sixth come had finished, but hadn't gotten fast when he heard what sounded like arguing, and turned to see Cindy frantically trying to push Ronnie aside as he continued to block her from exciting the cemetery gates. As the 9th stroke was sounded out, Jimmy ran back to try and help Cindy move Ronnie out of the way, asking Ronnie, "What the hell are you doing? Let her out." But Ronnie easily pushed Jimmy, who landed rough and hard on his. But just as the final chime sounded, Jimmy turned to watch as Cindy's image slowly faded until it was gone entirely. Jimmy got up and approached Ronnie, demanding to know if Ronnie had lost his mind, and told Ronnie, "You as good as killed her. I seen it. What is wrong with you?" To which Ronnie calmly replied, "A sacrifice must be made this year, as it has been every year, as it will be in years to come. Tell you what, hero next year you get to decide, because wanna know how the leader gets picked every year? It's really quite simple, and you won't go to the cops or anyone or say a single word about this to anyone. Not one single word to anyone ever. And next Halloween, you will pick the 10 and choose the sacrifice, or you be the one who fades away. And do you why? Like I said, it's quite simple. And with that, Ronnie gently reached out and touched Jimmy on the shoulder, and with an evil grin said loud enough for only Jimmy to hear, "Tag, you're it. Credit, Danelda Jordine." When I was younger, like many others, I loved to watch television. I know that's not an experience unique to myself, but it was truly my favorite thing to do. Undoubtedly, my favorite channel in my younger years was Noggin. I would always be so excited to come home from school and turn on the TV so I could enjoy the last couple hours of my favorite shows before it switched to the N at 6. I loved Moose A, Moose and ZD Bird, and I absolutely adored all of the little skits and songs they would put on in between the shows. Truthfully, I mainly watched Noggin just so I could see them. I was pretty impartial to the actual TV shows that would air on the channel. I remember how disappointed I would be when the sign-off sequence would begin just before dinner time, despite the fact that Done Day was a favorite song of mine. Though I was bummed that my Noggin viewing was coming to an end, I would sit in front of the TV in my living room, singing along until it was time to turn it off. I was in kindergarten when my Noggin fixation was at its peak, so I wasn't allowed to watch TV past 6 o'clock anyway. When I complained about this to my parents, they told me that only the mature shows aired past that time, and that Moose A Moose and ZD Bird would be back the next day. When I asked them if I could watch a little bit of the N just so I could see what it was, they told me that the shows they aired were too scary for children and that it would likely give me nightmares. Being a child who was spooked easily, I decided to take their word for it and just find something else to do. My mom was a nurse, and she usually came home around 6 on the nights that she worked. Occasionally, she would have to pick up overtime. So there were some nights she would come home a couple hours later. My dad, however, would already be home, as he started work early in the morning and ended his days early into the evening. I remember one particular day in November of 2007. My mother happened to be working later than usual, which again was completely normal for her job. My dad also happened to have started work a bit earlier in the morning than he usually did, as he was a bricklayer whose hours could vary slightly. Because of this, he would sometimes fall asleep on the couch not long after coming home from work. This day was no exception. On this night, I remember sitting in the living room watching Noggin just as I usually had done. My dad had been sitting on the couch behind me, but I noticed just before it was time to turn the TV off that he had fallen asleep. Silly Dad, I thought. However, this had given me what I thought was a brilliant idea. In my house, there was a television in the basement as well that was connected to cable. It was what my dad used on nights when he would invite his work friends over to watch whatever big sports events were going on. Even though my parents were usually the ones to turn on the television for me, I memorized which channel number Noggin was. It's also worth noting that despite being easy to scare, I had just celebrated my first Halloween without crying a single time while trick-or-treating, so I felt much braver than I had ever felt before. This newfound bravery inspired a new curiosity inside of me as to what the N was really about and why my parents had kept it from me all this time. My plan was that at approximately 5:45, I would switch off the TV in my living room in case my dad woke up and noticed that I had neglected to turn it off, as I had always been instructed to do. This would give me enough time to head to the basement and turn on that TV so that I could avoid being caught past my allotted watch time. So that is exactly what I did. I made sure to shut the basement door behind me and tiptoe down the stairs as quietly as possible. I had to fish my little hands between the couch cushions to find the remote, but I was successfully able to turn the television on once I did. When the screen lit up, my little fingers pressed 2 to 5/8 on the remote. Just as I had thought, the channel switched over to Noggin, and with little time to spare. The show, Max and Ruby, was currently airing. Just as I had switched to the channel, I could see Max and Ruby standing side by side waving to the audience as the screen faded to black. I then heard the whistling of Done Day and knew that my mission would be successful. "We're gonna say goodbye to the trees and bees," Moose sang, as I nestled down into my couch full of anticipation. Despite the fact that I was much braver now, I still couldn't shake the subtle feeling of anxiety that was tugging at me. It was a fun day, but now it's a done day. My legs began to bounce on the floor, as I could hardly contain my excitement any longer. The screen faded to black as the final line was played. I used my noggin today. I glanced over to the digital clock that was sitting right next to the screen, which read 6. The screen remained black for another moment, and then another moment, until eventually the clock read 6:01. I thought it was odd that it would take this long for the channel to switch over, but I figured it was so the other moms and dads could have a bit of time to turn it off before their children saw anything frightening. 6:03, the clock read, as I continued to sit in utter anticipation. I was starting to wonder if maybe there was something wrong with my TV, or if my parents had somehow set up a channel blocker that set into place after noggin ended. Just as I was growing impatient, a low humming sound started to emit from the speakers. That's odd, I thought. I had never heard the television make this sound before. The humming noise continued for another 30 seconds before the screen started to fade into something I could hardly make out at an excruciatingly slow speed. Eventually, I was able to make out what the channel was playing, statusy as it still was. It was none other than Moose A. Moose once again, but as the screen continued to slowly fade into his picture, the colors became more and more saturated. The humming sound increased, but I figured that perhaps the channel was having an issue connecting. "Are you ready?" An excited voice echoed through the TV. For some reason, the opening sequence of Noggin began to play. The difference was that for some reason, the audio was extremely distorted, so much so that it hardly sounded like Moose's voice at all. This made me feel slightly unsettled, as I knew the sign-on song didn't play until 6 in the morning. The crunchy audio continued to play through my speakers, while Moose and Z expressed their excitement for the coming day. Just as the song was about to end, however, something unusual was shown. Just as Moose sang, "I'm using my noggin today," the screen seemed to freeze, and the final chord of the ukulele started to repeat in a glitchy fashion. As it repeated, the colors of the screen gradually became even more saturated than before, with even more of a pixelated appearance. Moose's face became so obstructed that I couldn't even make out what was on the screen any longer. After what seemed like an eternity of witnessing this disturbing distortion, the audio stopped playing altogether. In place of Moose's eyes, a pair of bloodshot, humanistic eyes appeared on the screen and slowly blinked. When they reopened, the white of the eyes had turned completely red. After this, the screen quickly cut to black, the humming sound yet continuing. I was frozen on the couch in fear. Though I had never seen anything truly horrific in my life, I was smart enough to realize that this was far from normal. The darkness of the screen persisted even further until it once again cut to something different. The image depicted was much more clear than what had been previously shown, except I almost wished it hadn't been. Sitting on the hardwood floor of somebody's kitchen was a little girl who couldn't have been much older than 3. She had bright blue eyes and little blonde pigtails tied up with baby pink scrunchies. She wore a pink gingham dress that reached halfway down her calves and frilly white socks that looked almost whimsical. In her hands was a little doll adorned in the exact same outfit as she. It had the same beautiful blue eyes and bouncy pigtails as well. The little girl hugged the doll close to her chest as she hummed what sounded like "Mary had a little lamb to it" while rocking it back and forth. This scene played out for much longer than what felt comfortable, as if comfort was something I was even capable of reaching at this point. All of a sudden, The girl puts the doll down and stares directly into the camera. Unblinking, the girl stares and stares until suddenly her pupils begin expanding. They expanded past her irises and into the whites of her eyes until eventually her eyes were all black. A goopy, black liquid began to slowly pour out from the cabinets behind her. The humming sound that previously played returned, but this time it was even louder than before. As the liquid began to reach the motionless little girl and pool around her legs, her lips slowly parted to allow her to whisper to the audience, "We all die one day." The screen cut to black once more after this, but this time the humming disappeared with it. I was still frozen to my couch, in absolute shock. As much as I wanted to run up the stairs and jump into my dad's arms, I couldn't so much as twitch a muscle. I didn't understand what was going on. Why was the TV showing such morbid depictions? I knew that the N was for older kids, but what I had just witnessed couldn't possibly be appropriate for even them. Suddenly, the screen turned blue as the emergency alert system siren began to blare through the speakers. I jumped as the distinctive beeping rang throughout the basement. Words began to appear on the screen, but I was unable to make most of them out, as I was a bit behind the average child my age when it came to reading. I could, however, just barely make out the biggest word at the bottom of the screen. In all capital letters it read, "Help." Just as soon as I figured out what it said, the screen yet again went to black. This did not last for long, however, as the same bloodshot eyes that were earlier depicted on Moose A. Moose slowly reappeared on the screen. The eyes stared directly into mine, so intensely that I felt as though they were staring right through me. A song that seemed to have been reversed began to quietly play, growing louder with each passing second. As the audio grew louder, I noticed that the cable box had begun vibrating on the TV stand. A chemically smell filled the air as a light smoke began to rise up out of the box. I wasn't quite sure what to do, as I had never seen this happen before. Even if I had, I was far too terrified to even blink, let alone do something about it. The sound continued to grow, and the smoke began to thicken until suddenly I heard a loud pop, and the TV went black. The cable box had stopped vibrating, but smoke still emitted from the top. An error message flashed across the screen indicating that there was an issue connecting to the channel. I sat still for a moment, simply trying to process what had just happened. Who was the little girl, and why did she say what she did? How was she even old enough to be able to grasp the concept of death? Once I had composed myself, I hopped off of the couch and ran up the stairs to tell my dad what happened. I didn't want him to know that I had watched TV past 6 o'clock, so I just told him that there was a funny smell coming from the cable box. Maybe it was because I had woken him up from what seemed to be a deep sleep, but he did not seem to notice the sheer panic that I did my very best to hide. He didn't even question it when I asked him if I could sleep on his bedroom floor that night. The next morning, my mom woke me up to get ready for school. She sat me on the couch with my bowl of Apple Jacks while she searched for the TV remote to put on Noggin. As afraid as I was to bear witness to what I had seen the night before yet again, I was even more afraid to let on that I had tried to watch the N. To my surprise, everything was back to normal. An episode of Miss Spider's Sunny Patch Friends was playing with no distortions or anything. I was still hesitant to continue watching, but I had finished my breakfast and was ushered out the door to catch the school bus before I could think too much about it. When I got home that afternoon, I decided that I did not want to watch TV. Understandably, I was still a bit spooked by what I had seen. Even more than that, I was simply terrified to go into the basement. I decided to color instead. I couldn't find any blank sheets of paper, so I decided to scribble on the morning newspaper that was still sitting open on the kitchen table. During my drawing, something peculiar had caught my eye. There in the column featuring missing children was an all-too-familiar picture of a little girl sitting on her kitchen floor. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a pink dress that perfectly matched the one that the doll she was cradling was wearing. I couldn't make out much of what the title of her article said, but there was one word that I did recognize. Help. Credit, Monika Sterling. Subscribe for more horror stories every day.